It's really a great privilege to be here in Baltimore. I have been coming to Baltimore for a long time, ever since IYF moved here, which is 13 or 14 years ago. And indeed, I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania for 2 years, and that's when I first came to Baltimore in about 1897. And I guess everything that I can see from here then wasn't here. And it's the most fantastic thing to see how Baltimore is thriving and what a beautiful city it is. So it's always a real pleasure to be here. What I want to talk about today is a challenge that I think is facing all of us, though at first sight it may seem rather a long way away, although I do think that this line, where business is taught with humanity in mind, is a really great line. It's very unusual for a business school to feature such a sentiment. And so I have a feeling that this audience understands quite a lot of what I'm about to say, and if so, I'll say it rather quickly. But the fact is that we are facing a challenge in terms of youth in the world that will probably define this whole century. As I guess we all know, there are currently 1.3, 1.4 billion young people in the world, little people. Half the world, roughly, is under 25. And 90% of that half is in the poorest income group in the world, 10% poorest income group. There are at least 100 million young people right this minute totally unemployed across the world. And there are a further, according to the ILO, the International Labour Organization, there are a further 150 million people who are earning between $1 and $2 a day, who are said to be working, but in the way that we understand working, well, they probably are working very hard, but they're being paid next to nothing for doing that. And behind them are hundreds of millions more tiny children who are already born. They're there. So over the next 25 or 30 years, the world is facing the most incredible challenge of finding jobs, opportunities, and a future for this group. And I don't need to say to an audience like this how serious it will be if we fail to do that. I first understood the importance of this when I came as a graduate student and worked in Philadelphia for 2 years, and I managed to persuade them to allow me to be a substitute teacher in the Philadelphia school system. At the time, and of course it's true now, you couldn't do that unless you were an American citizen, which I wasn't. But there was a flu epidemic. So I volunteered, and they said, okay, you're not American. I said, no, but let's pretend you are. Which again, I have a feeling wouldn't happen now. So I ended up teaching in the Philadelphia school system 2 days a week for 2 years. And I understood then for the first time what it means not to have hope and not to have enough education, enough skills to be sure to have a job, and how corrosive that is for the future. And of course, exactly the same issues apply in large parts of Britain, in London, or large parts of Britain. So this is not a first world or a second world or a third world problem. It is, if you like, an all-world problem. But it is most acute not in rich countries like this one or the United Kingdom. It's most acute in the poorest parts of the world. And I first became aware of that at the World Economic Forum in Davos, in Switzerland, a while ago now, where I met the founder of International Youth Foundation, a man called Rick Little, who still lives just outside Baltimore. And he persuaded me that what the Financial Times should do is to produce every other year a special report on the world's youth, which had never really been done before. And that was 14 years ago, and we've now produced 7 of them every other year. And the most recent one, I think, is outside here, and you may want to have a look at it and take it away with you. And the idea was that we would make the business community across the world begin to focus on these specific issues. And indeed, the success of that has another great advantage in that we were trying to do was to say business can really make a difference to all of this. And if business succeeds in making a difference, this is a real win-win situation. Because these people are, of course, the future customers. They're the future markets. They are the future of the entire world. So if we, as business people, can actually make a connection here, then that will be good for business. And beyond that, of course, it is very, very important in terms of the political situation. Because even since my first meeting in Davos, the whole world has become much more interconnected. And many of us here are involved in international businesses. The Financial Times itself, when I first went to work there in 1897, just had one printing plant in London. Now it has 24 printing plants on 4 continents and sells nearly 80% of its print copies outside the United Kingdom. And its iPad application was awarded by Apple earlier this year, the application for the best news app of the year. And so not only is the newspaper printed everywhere in the world, more or less, but the digital revolution means that it is going to be pervasive in all kinds of different ways, already is, and that will go into the future. So this idea that we're all interconnected is very, very important. And I was talking to the Dean last night, and it's very clear that that is one of the organizing themes behind this school. That in fact the way the world relates to each other is a very, very critical thing for all of us to think about. If we fail to do this, my nightmare, the scenario that I think preoccupies me, and maybe all of us, is an image of the rich inside a house and the poor outside looking in. And if you think of the West, the developed world, as inside the house, and these masses of people outside, the question is, what will they eventually do if they feel they can never get inside? And the answer is, they will explode. And you can see that happening in various parts of the world already in small ways. You can see it in Mexico, where the youth unemployment rate is enormous. And the crime rate in Mexico and what is happening in Mexico is a real nightmare for the world. You can see it in Palestine, where the majority of people in Palestine are under 25. There are no jobs. And one of the most depressing times we ever spent was when, in the first month of the new millennium, we had an IYF meeting in Jordan, Palestine, and in Israel. And we went to Nablus, and we sat around a table with 15 of the smartest 18-year-olds in that town. And we said to them, who are your heroes? They had none. Not a single hero, not even Yasser Arafat, who in those days was leading the Palestinians and, of course, is now dead. And he wouldn't have been my hero, as he was anyway. But they didn't have any heroes. They had no real aspiration for the future at all. And you just have to look at some of these parts of the world to see little examples of what could happen big time if we don't accept responsibility for helping to get this right. So I guess what does that mean in terms of corporate social responsibility? Last night we had a panel, and one of our board members, Maria Katawi, who actually used to run the World Economic Forum a while ago, said she hated the word corporate social responsibility because it implied that somehow this was something you did at the end of the day if you had time. And actually, corporate social responsibility ought to be what companies do all the time. And I completely agree with her. I don't think we should be thinking about corporate social responsibility in a little box. What we need to be thinking about, and what we've tried to do in our own little way at the FT, is to bring this, so it's embedded in what we as business people do all the time. And those of you who are students, who are going to be leading the world tomorrow, that I think is a very, very important idea. That this is not something that's done on the edge. It actually is interwoven into the whole nature of what business has to do for the future of the world and for its own success. So, what should that mean? Well, first of all, I think it means that every business, everywhere it operates in the world, and Pearson, the company that I was a director of for 14 years, is actually the biggest educational publishing company in the world and operates in 61 countries. So everywhere in the world should be investing in entrepreneurship and in teaching and encouraging skills for young people wherever a company works. Not as a sort of option, but as a core belief in terms of what the company ought to be doing. IYF has a great program in Morocco, which is working to do exactly this. And in fact, IYF has programs in many parts of the world dedicated to this idea of encouraging entrepreneurship and upskilling people so they can go out and get real, lasting jobs. And it's very, very important. Secondly, harness technology. Technology is an enormous enabler for the future of the world. I'll give you an example. We started at IYF in partnership with Nokia and Pearson and a Philippine company that had the biggest mobile phone network, a project called Bridge IT. And Bridge IT worked on the basis that we would transmit basic lesson plans and science material into a set-top box made by Nokia for $11, connected to a television powered by the sun, using the Philippine network of our Philippine partner, which meant that in the middle of nowhere in the Philippines, teachers who had no lesson plans and no material, and very often actually no books, could for the first time, if they were teaching a science class, show their kids a volcano or show their kids an amoeba, because it was coming straight down into the set-top box, into the television, and transforming what they could learn. That program has been brilliantly successful in the Philippines. It's now operating in Tanzania, and we have plans to roll it out into 5 or 6 more countries in the course of the next year. It's important because it gives the kids a completely different horizon, and of course, because of the effect of AIDS in many parts of the world, it helps a little bit to compensate for the grave shortage of teachers, which is another huge problem for the world, because the teachers have been very badly affected, like everybody else, by the spread of AIDS. And then just last week, we were listening to an amazing guy who's American, who has started a little operation in Palestine called Souktel. And this is a business which uses the mobile phone to tell people where there are jobs and where there's training opportunities, because almost everywhere in the world now, whatever else there isn't, there is a mobile phone. So he started this business, and it's completely brilliant. So you can, if you're in the middle of Gaza, if you want to, you could look on your phone and see job opportunities, see training opportunities, and this will, in time, open up opportunities for all kinds of people who didn't have them. But in India, in Africa, in Indonesia, wherever you go, the power of the mobile phone as a way of teaching is enormous. And the Bridge IT idea was based simply on, if you can use this network, forget about computers. Computers break down, not if you're in the town, but if you're in the country and you're using a laptop and it breaks down, you've had it. What do you do? There's no one to repair it. Televisions don't break down. They're very robust. So sending signals that way, or on a mobile phone network, which is also very robust, is a great interim way of helping to do this. And along with this focus on training, we, I think, as business people, have got to recognize this is not just training in academic subjects. The real shortage in large parts of the world is of carpenters, electricians, plumbers, people who are doing the kind of jobs without which our societies wouldn't work, but actually are seen in many countries not to be high enough in prestige. And that has to be changed, because that's what many of these societies most need, along with academic qualifications. Next, I think, as businesses, we have to recognize the power of mentoring. And here I think everybody who works for our business ought to be a mentor to somebody else. Everybody can be a mentor. Now, maybe we need to use technology to help train people to think about how to do it. But most of us who've got good jobs and a good education have got skills to pass on, which we ought to be trying to pass on, wherever we are. And mentoring, in my mind, is not something that you leave to other people to do, or you do one day a year. You release your colleagues to work one day a year, go and mentor somebody. On the contrary, it's something that we ought to build into what we do in a business, because we have great skills, and there's nothing like the one-to-one relationship to pass them on. The founder of IYF had a great line which still drives us and which I find very moving. He said, every young person needs one person who is irrationally committed to their success. Not two, not a parent necessarily, one person who is irrationally committed to their success. And nothing demonstrates that more than being a mentor. And so those of us who have children spend our whole time mentoring, sometimes with very limited success in my case, but still, they spend the whole time so the idea that you can't do that, or is not the case. We can all do it, but it ought to be built into what a company does everywhere that they come, in all 61 countries where we operate. That is something that we build right in to what we're doing. And then, if you're in a business, and many of the people who are here today have already done this, we have to partner with organizations that are already doing things. Because the public-private partnership is very powerful. Nokia and the Philippine government is very powerful. And IYF has a whole host of partnerships with businesses, ranging from GE to Wrigley's to Caterpillar to Telefonica in Spain, a whole long list. And the advantage of these is that it brings two different kinds of expertise that's married together, and it enables both of us to work on programs that are scalable. So if you can prove that something works in one place, why couldn't you do it in lots of other places? And many of the companies that we work with already do that because they're international companies. They're operating globally on exactly that premise. I can sell this chewing gum here, I can sell it somewhere else. Well, if you can do that with chewing gum, why can't you do it with programs to encourage people, to upskill them, to encourage them to become entrepreneurs, to introduce them into the job market? The answer is, of course, you can. And so one of the great benefits of this partnership is the scalability of the way that it works. And we are very proud of how we have managed to develop programs in some parts of the world that are also working almost exactly the same, not quite, because every country is different, but almost exactly the same right across the world. And then I guess, finally, for business people, we have to remember not to give up. Because one of the consequences of these huge numbers, millions and millions and millions of people unemployed, is to say, oh, well, this problem is too big. There's nothing we can do about it anyway. So we'll worry about it and we'll be concerned about it, but actually, it's just too big. And I think that is just profoundly wrong, and it isn't how the world has changed. If the world had changed by taking that attitude, it never would have changed. And that was driven home to me in the Serengeti National Park in Tanzania, where it was founded. It's one of the great wonders of the world, this huge park teeming with wildlife, more or less protected from the rest of the world. And it was started by a German who did a completely brilliant job, and his son was killed in a plane crash when he was really quite young. And on the edge of this park, there's a little stone cairn, And on the side of it is a line which I think some of you may already have heard elsewhere, but in that place was, to me, incredibly moving. It simply said, "It is better to light a candle than to rail against the darkness." Better to light a candle than to rail against the darkness. In other words, if it's dark, one candle is some light. No candles is nothing. And I find that a very powerful idea. And of course, it's people with that attitude who have, all over the world in all kinds of different ways, changed it. So I think for those of us in business, or those of us who are going to be in business, that idea that it is possible to change things has to be at the core of what we're about. Now, what about government? Because NGOs, business, are not the only players in this world. And I think that the role of government is very, very important. And there's something else that Maria said last night really struck a chord with me. She said, if you go to a country and you do a deal, so you get a tax break in return for building a hospital, she said, you shouldn't do that. You should pay the taxes. And then you should be working as a taxpayer in a country to encourage the government to spend the taxes properly. Because actually, in many things, health, education, two of them, it's only government in the end that is going to be able to make a mass change to the situation. In India, it will only be if the government gets a grip on the Indian education system, some of which is totally brilliant, and some of which is totally unbrilliant. It will be only if the government gets a hold on that it will really change. And of course, in our life, in our own countries, it was when universal education was introduced by government that things really changed. That was the big opening of opportunities. And it's the same everywhere. So the role of government is critical. To encourage government is critical, which is why we work very closely with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which of course have got big opportunities to encourage government, and why that matters a lot. So government is very, very important as well, and we need to keep very good relationships with that. So I think that's really the nub of what I wanted to say this morning. It is a little bit early for this kind of stuff, but it is ultimately the way that I think we ought to be judging ourselves as business leaders, as future business leaders, as people of the world. And I can't say often enough what a disaster it will be if we don't get this right. I don't know in 30 or 40 years' time what the world will be like if it is still the case that the rich are living inside the house and all the poorest people are living outside and have given up any idea that they might one day get in. If that continues to be the case, then we're all in for a really, really hard time. And I think it's our duty to make sure that that doesn't happen. Thank you very much indeed.
And going back to something you alluded to earlier about persons feeling that they were locked out of the economic house, what would they do if they felt they didn't have an opportunity to get in? Given what we're seeing in the world right now with the tough economic times internationally, how can we avoid slipping into class warfare?
I think with very great difficulty, actually. I think that it's a big subject, this, and we were talking about it last night. It is a great paradox that the situation of the last 2 or 3 years has quite a lot to do with the, I shouldn't say failure, but with 1 or 2 problems in the banking sector. And I think that's that is irrefutable. And the banks in Britain and here and many other parts of the world, not many other parts, some other parts of the world, were actually rescued by the government. the people who have benefited most from government spending by a country mile are not the poor. They're not the people living on benefits or unemployment benefit. They are the banks. The scale of what was our insurance companies, the amount of money that went to AIG, for example, the amount of money is enormous. Now, I wouldn't argue with that for a second, and I think it's very good that it happened, and of course eventually the government will get it back, God willing. But the response of some of the banks to this, personally, this has nothing to do with the FT, but personally, I cannot understand. Because they seem to be saying, even though that's true, we're going to continue to pay ourselves big multiples of what ordinary people are paid. I use the word ordinary in the sense you probably would mean it too. And actually, we don't care about that. And we're going to continue to give ourselves huge, huge bonuses because we deserve it. And this idea that you can do this is, to me, I think future historians will think it is just inexplicable that they couldn't say, okay, for a year or 2 years, we won't do that. Or we'll do it half or a quarter. We'll recognize that, we are our brother's keeper. But that doesn't seem to be happening. It's certainly not happening in the UK. I don't get the sense that it's happening here. Those things will do more to fuel a class war, I think, than almost anything else. And so if we as business leaders are foolish enough not to understand that, then we will reap what we've sowed. And then I think we will get... So I don't think it's inevitable, but I think it is quite dangerous, in potential. Because it's the same, of course, with terrorism, that people can now see what is happening in the world in a way that they couldn't. I remember the present Indian Prime Minister, who is a very remarkable man. I remember meeting him when he was the finance minister 15 years ago. And he said, you don't understand our problem. He said, India has got to do in the next 20 years what Britain did in 200 years. Not just that, he said, but Britain didn't have television. Because he said, if we don't do it, everybody, even in the tiniest villages, can see. They can see the disparity. They can see the gap. And that will fuel real problems. He didn't talk about a class war, but that's the same thing. So I think that we have to recognize that we're not neutral in all of this. We have a responsibility. And I know that many of the people in this room are already very, very generous in the money they give and the help they give to all kinds of organizations. So they've kind of recognized that. But I think somehow some of these very large banks, and I've had this discussion with many big bankers, have simply got to understand they do not live in a bubble. And so if we don't get those kinds of things right, the risk of class war is a big one. And then that leads to violence, it leads to all kinds of things, which we must pray we avoid. So I think it's a real problem. And I think it's a very good question.
Thank you.
I have a question with regards to what you've done over your experience. What role does journalism, or can journalism play to help facilitate, if you will, a much more equitable business practice throughout the world?
There's good journalism and there's bad journalism. I think the best journalism can do a huge amount simply to introduce people to different ideas. I mean, when I started as a journalist, I remember the man who was my news, as we called it in England, the news editor, was a little local newspaper actually in Oxford. And I wrote a story and he tore it up. In those days it was on paper, of course. Now I just pressed delete, but in those, he tore it up. And he said, nobody cares what you think. You were supposed to write a story about what happened, which I've never forgotten. And so good journalism is actually about introducing people to what is happening in the world or in their own state or their own city, even if they don't want to hear it, and even if they didn't know they didn't know it. The great power of newspapers and the great worry about their disappearance, if that's what happened, would be they tell you the things you don't know you don't know. So good journalism is about introducing people to ideas they didn't know about, and making people aware of what is happening fairly. It's not the same as comment. Comment belongs on the op-ed pages, on the editorial pages. And I think one of the things that's happened, well, in British newspapers, which are some of the worst in the world, and more in television, ironically, than in newspapers, you see that distinction between comment and fact disappearing. So you'll see stories on television or on the radio which people will announce as a fact, something that is simply not a fact. I mean, a great example, and I'm not here being political at all, but was when Sarah Palin said that there were going to be death, that mustn't have health reform because there would be death panels that would decide whether or not her son could live. Now, that was just complete nonsense. I mean, nobody was suggesting that. It got a lot of play in Britain because she accompanied it by saying, of course, as happens already in Britain. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. And the importance of good journalism is not to attack her at all, but to simply say, well, actually, that isn't true. President Obama is not a Muslim. But 20% of, or some polls say, people think he is. Well, he isn't. And the only thing that stands behind, between real ignorance and that is newspapers, television, radio, in the best sense. And that's what the Founding Fathers understood. That's why the First Amendment guaranteed the freedom of expression, the freedom of the press, just for that reason. And we don't have an equivalent First Amendment in Britain. We don't have a constitution either, as you know. It's not written. So at any moment, I mean, we're not doing too badly, but nevertheless, in theory, all this could be swept away, this afternoon. So good journalism is very, very important. And good journalism involves trying to represent all sides of a subject, trying to give people a chance to understand what is really happening. And I think it's really very, very, very important. Now, whether it's on paper or whether it's on the internet or whether it's on a tablet, that doesn't matter too much, as long as it's there. Take it away, and then society is very vulnerable, I think. So I think it's very important.
I was thinking about the programs that you talked about when you were at Financial Times and Pearson, the social programs. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what do you think is going to be required to have institutional investors look at organizations like Financial Times or Pearson that are engaging in this work and actually place a value on that in the economic system when they're making their investment decisions?
I think that's a really good question, and I have to say I don't have the slightest, I really don't know the answer to it. I think if you look at Bill Gates, there is the man who, having made unimaginable sums of money, has effectively given almost all of it away. And he's got a little bit left, I think. So he got that. Warren Buffett got it. I guess the people who set this business school got it. So there are people who understand this and do it. But in the investment community, which I think you're talking about, for reasons that I don't really understand, they will not take these things into account at all. They don't value them. And I think it's because they only value what they can measure, and you can only measure something, they think, in numbers. And numbers do certain things, and therefore you concentrate on the numbers. The fact that you can concentrate on the numbers and then quite suddenly they'll all have exploded because something else is happening in left field is very hard for institutional analysts in the kind of way we've developed them to understand. And one of the things that I'm most impressed with, and we were talking about this last night, it seems to me that this school is starting from the premise that actually you've got to think about all of these things as part of the process of deciding what you do. Not in order to lose money and not in order to not to want to make a profit. Nothing to do with that. It's just recognizing the world as it actually is And whether it's in London, in the city, or in Wall Street, it's an uphill struggle to get some of these guys to understand that. And I don't quite know what you do. It's the same syndrome, if you like, as the bonuses. It just seems to me to be self-interest, but they don't quite get it. So how you do that, I don't quite know, other than to keep on saying to people, this is the reality. And unless you accept that in measuring companies, that's a valuable thing for them to be doing, you're going to just, ultimately, quite suddenly, you're going to suffer. But, they don't see it that way.
You spoke about the Financial Times every other year doing a status of the world's youth report.
As
Two
what?
questions about that. One is, what have you found most interesting finding over the years? And two, how has it been used best, as you see, or what kind of catalyst has it been to make change?
Well, I think that the most interesting thing has been that until we started doing this, lots of people have thought about this for a long time, but in terms of our readership, until we started doing this, a lot of our readers had never really thought about youth as an issue on its own. Even the World Bank, actually, I think Bill will correct me, but I think we played a little bit of a role in persuading the World Bank to start thinking specifically about youth. They were very, very, it's a wonderful organization, and they were very preoccupied with children from 0 to 6, because that's a big, big issue. And actually the world has made big progress in that age group. They hadn't quite thought about 6 to 22 or 14, or that age group, which is, as I was trying to say, is huge. So I think what we've done is to help, in a small way, to focus attention on that. And the number of companies that are now doing things in this area is far greater than it was. Not because of the FT, actually, but just because that's the way the world has developed. But I suppose my argument is it's far greater than it was, but it's still a drop in the ocean. It's a very big sea, and this is a very small drop still. And what we've got to recognize is that we've just got to raise our game. So I think we're pleased. I mean, the Christmas appeal this year that the Financial Times is having is for hunger in the world. And every day this month, they will be running stories about hunger. And our readers, by and large, in fact, not by and large, definitely, are not hungry. So what we want to do is to introduce them to these kinds of issues. We also do a program which just raised nearly $1 million for homeless people in London as part of a Christmas. So in our own little way, that we're trying to introduce people to these ideas. And it does have an impact. But we all have to do it, and we all have to do it, I think, on a bigger scale.
I found it interesting when you mentioned that some of the industries in the world today that are most coveted, if you will, are not necessarily that of higher education or academia, but rather of carpentry and household engineering, plumbing, whatever you may have. And I wholeheartedly agree with that statement, so much so that I've assembled a team and I'm trying to provide applicable education to underprivileged children in Bangladesh, actually, and that's where I'm from. And one of the problems that my team and I have come across is that of sustainability, because it seems that people would rather give you some money up front and hope that you'll be able to use it to sustain the business. And obviously the problem that I've come across is that, how do you actually sustain a business like this when these children do not have the means to finance the education? And second of all, how do you get them on board to begin with? Because in a lot of sense, I don't mean this to sound derogatory, but these children, in a lot of ways, they're narrow-sighted and they want to do something that'll bring money on the table immediately, bring food on the table immediately, rather than invest something that will eventually, they'll be able to reap the rewards from.
I was in Bangladesh a couple of years ago, and I was very impressed by what I saw, actually. People forget that Bangladesh is one of the lowest lying countries in the world, isn't it? And regularly is overwhelmed by huge water waves. And this country, which is also one of the poorest in the world, has developed a way of moving huge numbers of people out of harm's way incredibly effectively. We tend only to read about the times when that doesn't work, but most of the time that it does. So that led me to think, and I remember talking to somebody from a microcredit bank there, that there is a great deal of talent there. Well, you know this as well as I do. So, if you get young people and say, I'm going to train you to be a carpenter or a plumber, what this man said was, they will do it. They will work, and they will work, and they will want to do it. What they need is enough revolving credit to have the project that teaches them doing it, and then as they start to make money, to pay it back. And if you think about the way we live, we take credit completely for granted. We couldn't operate as a country, as a state, as individuals without credit. And that is what is missing. And the microcredit revolution in Bangladesh has gone somewhere, hasn't it, towards helping that. But I think we want to institutionalize that more. So I would say with your little thing, you should find a bank and say, look, you lend us money to fund this, and we will have a business plan. We'll start paying you back. When these pupils start going out to work, we will take a proportion of, but various different ways. But it is the $64,000 question for this whole, for everybody. How do you get enough credit to get the ball rolling? I mean, in Tanzania, of course, the most powerful people in Africa are very often women. I mean, it might be true actually everywhere, but it certainly is true in Africa. And we gave the women in this little village goats. And these goats, they had done really well. And with the goats, the milk, and everything else, they then generated revenue. They can buy more goats. And then they have their own little system. Now, it's not enough to pay for the health center, but it is nothing like. But that's another way to do it. But I think you want to find people who are willing to give you enough, it's not a lot of credit to get this going, and then find a way of recycling it. And then as it grows, then it grows. But I think it's a great thing fantastic thing you're doing.
Thank you.